Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's so lovely that you are all with us today. Welcome to our 33rd CAQDAS Networking Project webinar. The CAQDAS Networking Project is based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey, and this is our second webinar of this academic year. My name is Sarah Bullock, and our webinar today is going to be given by my colleague, Dr. Christina Silva, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. Just before we move on to the webinar today, we just wanted to draw your attention to a few other activities of the CAQDAS Networking Project at the moment. We have our usual introductory courses running, but we also are really excited to announce a couple of new workshops. One specifically around using digital tools for qualitative text analysis, and one for using digital tools around visual analysis. So do have a look at our website if you're interested in any of those. You'd be very welcome to come and join us there. We also have more webinars coming in the series. We are just finalizing some details on these before we're going to advertise them. But so do keep an eye on the website and social media channels for information about those as we schedule them. And if you personally are interested in contributing to our webinar series, please do get in touch. We would really absolutely love to hear from you. All webinars are recorded, and including this one, and you're going to be sent a link to the recording of this webinar after we finish today. If you're interested in looking at any of the previously recorded webinars, they're all up on our YouTube channel, and the link to it is there, and I'll share that again in a moment during the webinar. So let's move on to the business of today. So we are very lucky to have Christina talking to us today. Christina is the manager of the CAQDAS Networking Project, and she first started teaching there in 1998. And since then, she's worked both through the CAQDAS Networking Project and as a co-founder and director of qualitative data analysis services. She has trained thousands of researchers all over the world in a wide range of computer-assisted qualitative data analysis packages, and written many a book on the topic as well. In supporting researchers through all of these years, there have been many recurring issues that have come up for Christina, and one of the common areas of interest across students is quite often thematic analysis. And given that, Christina has felt that it would be useful perhaps to spend a bit of time exploring today how this method may be used in relation to software. And so whilst Christina is speaking today, feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have in the chat, and I'll collate those and then put them to Christina at the end. Okay, so hopefully that sounds okay to everybody. Really looking forward to this, Christina. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sarah. It's lovely to be here with you all. I'm just going to share my screen and get that going first of all. There we go. You should be able to see my first slide. And I just need to let you all know, thank you. Just need to let you all know that I've got a slightly croaky voice, so there's probably going to be some coughing and maybe some spluttering going on my end during this session. So I apologise for that. A couple of days ago, I couldn't speak at all. So I'm just happy that I'm hopefully going to get through this with my throat today. Before we get started, and I say a little bit about what I'm hoping to cover today, it would be really useful just to get a little bit of a sense of who's here in the room with us today. So what I'm going to do is in the chat of Zoom, there is a link which I've just put in there, which will take you to a Google form, which has got a few questions in it around your thoughts and use of thematic analysis and qualitative software right now. It's just a few questions just to get a sense of where you're all at. So if you don't mind clicking on there and just answering those questions, I will pop back excuse me, and have a look at the answers in a couple of minutes once I've got going. So thanks for that. It's completely anonymous, so just a little bit of a getting to know you poll. Fabulous. Okay, so let's get started. And I want to start off with a little bit of contextualization about thematic analysis, because thematic analysis is an umbrella term under which are many different ways of thinking about and going about doing analysis with qualitative materials. And the different thematic analysis approaches have quite a long history, actually, although thematic analysis has very much been popularized by Braun and Clarke in the last couple of decades. And you will have seen, if you've looked at my poll, that one of the questions is whether you're thinking about drawing on their work. But it's really important to be aware that their work is one approach to thematic analysis. So I want to place our thinking about thematic analysis in a broader context initially, before I start speaking about their approach in a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I'd like to touch on briefly is the idea that not only are there a range of approaches within this broad umbrella term of thematic analysis, there are also different ways of conceptualizing the differences between thematic analysis approaches. And there are also, in that context, a number of terminological confusions. So authors are using terms to mean the same terms to mean different things, maybe, and sometimes different terms to mean the same thing. And that's actually a characteristic of much of the field of qualitative research. And that's one of the kind of aspects of the field that we have to kind of navigate or disentangle as we locate our own work. So let's just think about that very loosely, very broadly. Braun and Clarke talk about differentiating between this broad field of thematic analysis by speaking to the idea of a methodological spectrum. And they talk about how different approaches to thematic analysis sit in different places on that methodological spectrum. Within that, it's also true to think about alternative ways of differentiating between the practices, maybe, of thematic analysis approaches. So one of those ways would be the idea of directionality. And by that, we mean whether you're generally developing the analysis in an inductive, bottom-up way, in a kind of theory building way, generating themes from the data that you're working with, from the materials that you're working with. But it's also possible to work in thematic analysis approaches in a more top-down deductive way, or indeed by combining approaches. So as well as thinking about the methodological spectrum, which is the way that Braun and Clarke have differentiated thematic analysis in their most recent textbook, this idea of directionality is quite important also, and as is the idea of quantification. Now, it might seem that when I get on to thinking about the methodological spectrum a little bit more in a moment, it might feel that directionality and quantification are related to the different areas of the methodological spectrum. And that is one way of thinking about things. But it's not true, I don't believe, that those differences are necessarily sitting in the same place along that spectrum. So I like to think about a range of different ways of thinking about conceptualizing the different thematic analysis approaches. And hopefully that will come to life a little bit more in a moment. Before I move on to that, it's also just worth being very clear that not all authors define precisely what they mean by thematic analysis or conceptualize their approach within this broader frame. And that's something that has historically potentially been problematic in us navigating our way through. So let's think a little bit about that methodological spectrum. And this slide here is visualizing this idea of a spectrum drawn on the work of Braun and Clarke. They have a table in their textbook where they talk about these different approaches, which they characterize as being big Q, big qualitative, small Q, and then medium Q. And they differentiate between reflexive thematic analysis, which they see as being on the kind of big qualitative end of the spectrum, ontologically in the space of kind of more relativist approaches and interpretivist and constructivist epistemologies, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, they talk about coding reliability approaches to thematic analysis, which they describe as small q, and that sits more in the kind of positivist side of things. And then they talk about medium q thematic analysis as approaches which are characterized as codebook approaches to thematic analysis, and they give a few examples, including the ones I've got on this this slide, but also some other ones. So this is the way that they are placing their work in that broader frame. It's really important, I think, to make it very clear, as they do themselves, that this is not about saying which approach is better than another, but it's about placing the way that they go about thematic analysis in the context of other approaches. And I think that's really important for all of us to do. And it could be that you're doing a different type of thematic analysis, but being aware of where that sits, and this is their conceptualization of that. Not the only conceptualization, but their conceptualization. Okay, I am going to be speaking mainly about reflexive thematic analysis today. Let's just see if that sits well with the audience here today. So I've just brought up the responses to the poll so far. So most people are doing a thematic analysis project right now. Okay, so I was right in my assumption that most people are thinking of or will be drawing on Braun and Clarke's reflexive analysis. Not all of you are, and some of you are not sure. That's absolutely fine, obviously. The other question I had was to do with whether you are using or intending to use a qualitative software program, a CAQDAs package, as we tend to call them. And again, most of you are, but not all of you. And it's really important, I think, just to be very clear in the context of these webinars that myself and Sarah either deliver ourselves or host others doing all kinds of different work using different tools. You know, it's never our intention to say that you should be using software, or that any particular software program, or indeed any particular analytic method, is better than another. It's all about opening up ideas and thinking about what the options are and making appropriate choices in the context of particular objectives. So it's very interesting to see those responses from those of you who filled that in. So thanks for that. I'd also be very interested in hearing in the chat if you are intending to use a qualitative software package, which one you're intending to use. It's always interesting for us to hear that. So if you would like to, then please just pop that into the chat and we can have a look at that as we go. All right. So let's just move on. So I am going to be using Braun and Clarke's process as an example today, but I just wanted to make it really clear that there are a number of other textbooks about thematic analysis, and a few of them I've got up here, and there are also a range of articles that talk about particular approaches and how to go about those. So just to place Braun and Clarke's approach, their latest textbook, which was published at the end of last year, is there on the right-hand side of the slide. Okay, one more thing to say about software and method before I get on to the detail of their way of thinking about things, which is framework analysis, which is one of the approaches to thematic analysis that some of you might be aware of, some of you might have used, and was actually developed in the 1980s by NatCen, the National Centre for, what are they called? I can't remember what they're called. I completely lost my mind. Sarah will find out and put it in the chat. NatCen, who developed the method framework, and they used to do that on big pieces of paper, and then they used to do framework as a thematic approach in Excel spreadsheets, and then they developed their own software, which they called Framework. That was available for a number of years as a piece of software that you could purchase and use. And after a while, they decided not to continue supporting and developing that software, because really they were researchers rather than software developers. And they sold that technology to NVivo, who in an earlier version of NVivo, I apologize that this screenshot is very hazy. It's a very old screenshot because it's from when Framework was first integrated into NVivo. So it's showing an older version of NVivo. But this is also possible in other software programs as well. So I just wanted to bring that up at the outset, just to contextualize our thinking about methods and the tools that have been developed to support methods, which is what we're transitioning to talk about in a little bit more detail. Okay, so one other thing, which is there are also other textbooks and articles that talk about other approaches to thematic analysis. Template analysis is one approach, and the qualitative data analysis textbook there by Miles and Huberman from 1994. 1994 feels like quite a long time ago now, but this is still one of my favorite textbooks on qualitative data analysis. I think it's really excellent, even though it was published a long time ago. And they talk about matrices and matrix analysis as well, which is now often thought of and discussed as a form of thematic analysis. Okay, so that's a little bit of kind of context before I dive into the detail. National Centre for Social Research. Yes, thank you, Sarah, for helping me with my memory. I blame it on my throat. Okay, so just as a summary, thematic analysis is really usefully thought of as a method rather than a methodology. Okay, although some forms of thematic analysis are definitely methodologically placed, that's not necessarily true. And that spectrum that I had up earlier is something that we can move along within a particular project, and definitely when we're using software, which is the focus of our thinking in today's session. Okay. And that's very much encapsulated by a number of thematic analysis authors, including Boyantzis from 1998, who describes and emphasizes the flexibility of thematic analysis in that context, describing it as a process that can happen inductively or deductively, as I mentioned earlier. So that's really important generally. Therefore, the aims are flexible in a thematic analysis, okay? But on some level, we are interested when we're doing forms of thematic analysis in identifying, analyzing, and interpreting patterns of meaning, okay? What those patterns of meaning look like, how we believe them to manifest themselves in the materials that we're looking at, may vary quite significantly across approaches. Braun and Clarke would think about those patterns of meaning as being the themes that we are constructing within and across the data. But that's not the only way of thinking about what themes might be. To do with that, themes can be implicit or explicit. So explicit themes, excuse me, explicit themes might be ones that are clearly, obviously visible in the materials on some surface level, whereas implicit themes are uncovered and constructed by us through the interpretive process. And that's a very different way of thinking about working with material, both of which are relevant across thematic approaches. As I mentioned earlier, it could be theory building or theory testing. It's possible to do thematic analysis when I'm testing something in my data, as opposed to or as well as building theory. And the last thing really is to think about the types of data that lend themselves to thematic analysis approaches. And for me, that can be any form of structured or semi-structured or unstructured qualitative material. So I think that we have a large amount of materials at our disposal that are that can be looked at through this analytic lens, as it were. Okay, so I've now got a series of slides which depict the process of thematic analysis, just giving a few examples from different approaches. So this is Crabtree and Miller's approach to template analysis, and they discuss 6 different steps in their process. Framework analysis is normally described by Ritchie and Spencer, who were working at NatSen in the 1990s and also earlier. They have 5 phases of framework analysis. Oyatzis from 1998, which is often seen to be on the other end of the methodological spectrum from reflexive thematic analysis. They have also steps in the process, but Oyatzis is talking about different types of thematic analysis in that textbook, not just this theory or prior research-driven approach. Another approach to template analysis is by King and Brooks from 2016, and they have 6 steps in their process. And what we're going to focus on is Braun and Clarke's 6 phases as they describe them in their 2021 textbook. What I haven't really got time to do today is to look at those different steps or phases from those different approaches and kind of map them against one another. But there are some similarities and overlaps, and there are some differences in sequencing and tasks. And it's quite useful to look at that, even though we're not going to be doing that explicitly today. I just wanted to give you a flavour of the sense that other authors are also describing their process. Okay, what I'm going to do with the rest of the session today is to go through, if I make it through, to go through these 6 phases and talk about how Braun and Clarke describe them, and then how software that is designed to facilitate qualitative analysis can help us in these phases. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the first phase, which they talk of or define or describe as familiarizing yourself with the data set. And what I've done on the next slide here is just taken a photograph of their high-level description of this phase, this first phase, which comes from page 35 of their textbook, where they've got a nice table that describes at this kind of level of detail the different phases. The rest of the book goes into a huge amount of more detail, which is really great. But for our purposes today, this is sufficient to think about. What I've done here, before we look at the detail, is I've highlighted in red the tasks that are accomplished in this phase, as described here, and in green, the levels at which we work when doing those tasks. And for me, differentiating between the tasks that we undertake and the level of which that happens in our analysis is quite a useful thing to do. So in phase one, they talk about becoming deeply and intimately familiar with the content of the materials that you're working with, your data set, through this process of immersion, okay? Practically, they talk about this as involving reading and rereading data. And if you were working with the transcripts of audio, listening to the recordings as well, at least once, and making brief notes about any analytic ideas or insights we may have when we're going through that reading and rereading and listening process. But making those notes both at the level of the data item and the level of the data set as a whole, okay? So I'm going to pick that apart slightly and think about how software can help us with those tasks at those levels. So the first thing to think about is this idea of immersion, okay? For me, that involves working at the level of the data, okay? And when we use software, qualitative software, CAQDAs-packages, that can happen in a slow, low way, okay? Or a fast, high way. And I want to just reflect a little bit on those two ways of going about it. They talk about making brief notes about the analytic ideas. And for me, this is the slow, low way of going about things. But they also talk about reading and rereading. And that can happen in a slow way, low way, but it can also happen in a fast, high way. And for me, there are tools in qualitative software which are really useful for this. So let's think about this a little bit more. In terms of making brief notes about analytic ideas related to each data item, remember that's one of the levels, that can happen by annotating, commenting, or linking notes or memos to bits of data, okay? The terminology, I've tried to be loose in my terminology here. Each software program talks using different terminology, unfortunately. But the idea is that we can make notes and link them, attach them to each data item. And we can also attach bigger notes to the whole data set in various ways, using various tools, memos, documents, journals, they may be called, depending on the software that you're using. So I'll show you a couple of screenshots about that in a moment. But I also just want to pick out the idea that when we start using software, then we have at our disposal a whole number of search tools that allow us to see what's in the data very quickly based on its content. Okay, so we can find material using word frequency tools, text search tools, phrase finders, concept finders, and various other tools, and we can visualize what we find in a number of different ways. And again, I'll show you a few of these in a moment. Related to the brief notes that we might make at the different levels, that can happen also in the data. So those notes are always visible in various ways in the data and also gathered together via some kind of collection device in the software that we're using. And that's sometimes, but not always, a code. Okay, we can also export the notes that we take attached to the data that we've taken those notes on. Okay, so there's lots of different tools that we have across these programs that can help with this familiarization process. So let's just have a quick look at some of these. Now, before I show you any screenshots, it's really important just to make it very clear that the examples that I'm using from different software programs today have been chosen because the screenshots illustrate something very nicely. They illustrate the point that I'm making. I'm not at all attempting to make a comparative assessment amongst these different software programs that I'm showing you. And just because I show you something in one software doesn't mean that this is the best software for doing this or that it's not possible in others. It's just that this visualization brings it to life nicely. Okay, there are other webinars that we've done which go through comparisons in more detail. That's not my intention with this webinar. I just want to bring to life the general possibilities rather than making any statements about which programs are better or not for certain things. Okay, so here is a screenshot from Quirkos where some text here, this is actually some text that I wrote about the way that I teach, so a reflexive piece from my own research. And I've made little notes associated with bits of the data that are visible alongside the data inside Quirkos all the time. And that's a really nice view, which is very similar in many other programs. Something similar I can see here in the software F4 Analyze, whereby those notes are sitting underneath the text. So the actual material, qualitative material, is sitting here with the white background, and then the little yellow highlight background are little annotated notes. They're called memos in F4 Analyze, proliferated in between the data. So lots of different ways that can be visualized. But what we're doing here is we're making notes at the level of each data item, meaning each bit of data that we see to be interesting or meaningful. Okay, let's go to the fast high level of familiarization. This is a screenshot from WordStat, which is the tool we're looking at here. Is essentially a phrase finder where we have quickly asked the software to tell us what the common phrases are in the data. And it's given us a list of phrases with the frequency, okay? And it's also here giving us other larger phrases within which a particular phrase occurs. So that, for me, is another way of familiarizing with the data, but at a completely different level. And that can often, those kind of phrase finders can often be visualized in a cloud. So this is a phrase cloud, if you like. This is actually from MAXQDA. So this is just showing you a visualization of a similar feature in MAXQDA. And these are not words. This is not word frequency. This is phrase frequency illustrated as a cloud. Something very different in terms of visualizing, familiarizing with our data here is coming from Leximancer, which is showing us topics that have been identified and their clusters and their size in terms of the content that sits behind them. And it will look at the data and generate these clusters of topics and visualize them for us. My last screenshot comes from ATLAS.ti, which shows us similar things here. This is to do with what they're now calling opinion mining, and it's giving us some information here about the number of matches. But really importantly, alongside that visualization, we get to see the actual data, the actual qualitative data. Now, that's also true for the other three. We can get at the qualitative data, and that interconnectivity between a visualization, which is the result of a high level familiarization or exploration, is always connected to the source data in these software programs. That's the whole point of them, actually. So that interconnectivity is really important in terms of familiarization. So hopefully showing you a few of those ideas gets us to think about how software can contribute in both familiarization at those different levels within our work. Okay, let's move on to the second phase, which Braun and Clarke talk about or describe as coding. Many of us engage in coding, whether we're doing thematic analysis or not. And they talk here about working systematically through the materials in a fine-grained way, identifying segments of data that appear potentially interesting, relevant, or meaningful, according to the research questions, and applying pithy, analytically meaningful descriptions, code labels, to them. They talk about the focus of coding being specific and detailed, with the coding aimed at capturing a single meaning or concept, so not multiple things going on in one code. Again, they talk about coding at different levels, and they talk about capturing the need to capture your analytic take on the data through the coding process, okay? And they also talk at the end here in this red highlight about collating the code labels and compiling the relevant segments of data for each code. So I'm going to pick out those things and show some of the tools that we have available in qualitative software that can help with these aspects. So the first thing I want to say is that this coding work in qualitative software needn't be completely separate from the first phase. It can be if you want it to be, but we can build on the previous phase when we're working in software. And I'll show you a very powerful example of that in a moment. We can also code separately from taking notes. Okay, so that's completely at our discretion how we want to do that. If we want to build directly on the earlier work, then we can pull out those annotation comments or notes that we've made previously and code them. Okay, so that's a very integrated, interconnected development of the phases, but we can also do it completely separately if we want to. Okay. There are all kinds of ways that we can capture analytic meaning in our use of qualitative software, which go beyond the labels that we give the codes. The labels of the codes are really important, but we have other features in software that can help with that process as well. And I will show a few of them to you, including colors, grouping, and linking memos. The other thing that I want to say before I show you a few screenshots is that this idea of collating the code labels and compiling the data segments is something that happens as part of the coding process in CAQDAs-packages. It just happens as you code automatically. You don't have to do it as a separate stage in the process. And for me, that really facilitates the continual retrieval, reviewing, recoding, the iterative process that Braun Clarke and many authors of many qualitative methods describe in their writing. I also want to say that qualitative software programs allow us to auto-code. They allow us to say, well, okay, I found those frequently occurring phrases or words. Let me now quickly code every sentence in which they occur. And that has a place in some forms of thematic analysis for all kinds of different purposes. Okay, what does this look like? This is a screenshot from MAXQDA that has a tool called categorizing paraphrases, which is specifically designed to move from that initial familiarization process when we're making little notes and not thinking about coding to then coding in a way that builds on those paraphrases. So what I've got here in this table is a list of the segments of data that have been written about, have been annotated, if you like, and then the content of that annotation, they call them paraphrases in MAXQDA, and they can then get coded. And then both the segment of data and your comment that you made previously get conceptualized at a code. So that's a very integrated movement from one phase to another. I wanted to also show you, this is also from MAXQDA, the idea that we can color codes. In most programs, it's possible to color codes, and the color of the codes appear in the margin. I'm hoping that you can see my purple cursor here showing you the colors of the codes. In some programs, you can highlight the text in the color that you apply the code, and you can also link memos at various places in the software. Here I've got a code called reflexivity check, where every time I see something in the data or in my own notes about the data that makes me have a reflective thought about my role in the process or the way my methods are shaping what's going on, then I will add a little note about reflexivity check. So that's just a couple of ways in which the capturing of analytic meaning can happen in all kinds of different places within software. We can also see, this is going back to F4 Analyze, so I showed you this earlier, but this time I want to highlight to you that in this program, the code colors here on the right-hand side are appearing in underlinings underneath the text in the in the material rather than down the margin side. So different programs visualize the codings in different ways. But here, hopefully, you can see how the coding can be fully integrated with the earlier analytic note-taking within the data in these different programs. Let's think about organizing and grouping codes a little bit as a means of capturing analytic meaning. Here we have got a screenshot from NVivo showing us top-level codes and subcodes, and that's one way of starting to think about capturing meaning. We can also do that and visualize that in a set and a map. So this is visualizing different codes from different areas in a hierarchical coding schema and putting them together and thinking about them separately from that hierarchical coding schema. So lots of different ways of playing around with codes and ideas. And finally, that point that the collation happens automatically. This is a screenshot from Delve. So here what we're doing is no, this is not Delve, sorry, this is Taguette, which is a free software. And here I'm looking at all of the bits of material that have been coded at one particular code, which I've called here qual-quant debate. And it's showing me that some of these segments of data are also coded to other codes. And that's just happening and being shown to me all of the time. Okay, so that's quite a lot of detail about those first two phases. The next three phases, phase 3, 4, and 5 in Braun and Clarke's process, I'm going to talk about a little bit more together, because I think that when you're using software, these things happen kind of more together. It's not a linear process necessarily, and actually Braun and Clarke talk about how, even though they describe the process as these distinct phases, in reality it happens in a much more iterative, free-flowing way, and that's very much reflected and facilitated by the software. So the key things that I want to pick out for phase 3, generating initial themes, is the idea that we want to identify shared patterns of meaning across the data set and compile clusters of codes. Okay, and the other key thing they say here is that we want to collate all of the data relevant to each candidate theme. So we're looking at the initial codes and then we're generating potential themes, candidate themes from them. And the software is definitely designed for this kind of process. So first of all, we have many different tools available to us in CAQDAs-packages that allow us to identify, explore, think about, reflect on patterned meanings across the data set at the conceptual level. And I'll show you a couple of screenshots of some queries and some visualizations to bring that to life for you. We can also compile clusters of codes in a whole range of different ways using hierarchies, which I've already shown you sets and maps. And thirdly, of course, as we already know, the collation is happening all the time. So when we're bringing codes together, the collation of the data is happening continuously and incrementally just by virtue of being in the software. So it's not a separate step. What does that look like? Here I've got a screenshot from ATLAS.ti looking at one data file. This is actually an article from a piece of literature showing you the co-occurrence of code. So one of the things that's really easy to visualize in software is where a segment or two overlapping segments have been coded to more than one code. And that's one aspect of thinking about patterns within a data file. Okay. My next screenshot is from Dedoose, which shows us something similar, but in a different way. So this segment, it's an excerpt from Dedoose or a selection, has got 3 codes associated with it. So that's visualized always very easily, but in different ways, slightly in different programs. But also, and this is coming from this final screenshot here is coming from NVivo. This is showing that when we're inside a code, so all of the data I'm looking at here, these 3 segments here, they are all coded at one particular code, social connection, and I'm able to view on the margin here the other codes that co-occur. So the other 2 examples were examples of looking at one piece of data and how codes are occurring or co-occurring in one piece of data. What I'm showing here is how other codes co-occur with one code across the whole data set. And that is something that is incredibly difficult to generate when you're working outside of software that has been designed for the purpose. Okay, another way of thinking about this is exploring patterns. So I've gone back to Dedoose here now, and in the background I've got a table giving me some numbers. This is a co-occurrence of codes by code. So picking out those co-occurrences that we were just looking in the data, but at a higher level across everything, showing us where the gaps and clusters are in terms of the relationships between the codes according to how I've coded the data. So this is giving us numbers. We may not be interested in the numbers in our reflexive thematic analysis, but I would still do these kinds of visualizations because behind each cell is the qualitative data. So what I've got here, the text excerpts full view, is showing me the excerpts. I think it's from this intersection here. In fact, it may be a different one. It doesn't really matter which one it is for the purposes of what I'm saying. I can pull out the qualitative material that sits behind an intersection and then also see what other codes are there as well. So that's very powerful in terms of picking out patterns and relationships. I'm going to run out of time, I've just noticed. So let me show you something else. Visualizing coding. This is a hierarchy chart. So from a thematic analysis perspective, this is giving me a visualization of the proportion of the data set that's coded to particular codes and their subcodes. So we might think about the bigger squares here, this darker blue as being a theme, or this green here as being a theme that has properties or dimensions or sub-themes. And it's just giving me a sense of the proportion. Based on frequency, yes, but again, I may not be interested in the frequency. I may just be interested in visualizing the patterns and then going in and seeing the data that sits behind them, because again, this is connected with the qualitative data that sits behind it. And for reflexive thematic analysis, that's incredibly powerful. Here is a screenshot from another software showing something similar to what we saw in Leximancer previously, looking at clusters of themes. Okay, so that was a little bit about generating initial themes on the conceptual level, but something that we can also do in software is to do that, identify and explore shared pattern meaning across the data set at the comparative level, because it's always possible to put into our software project factual characteristics, applying factual characteristics to the units of analysis in our project. And that might be demographics of participants or group characteristics or whatever we are interested in terms of the units of our analysis. And we can generate groups based on those characteristics, and we can make comparisons and visualizations through use of queries. So I'm just going to show you a few of those visualizations. So here again from MAXQDA, we have a matrix of codes. These are descriptive codes at the moment, capturing different people and how they're spoken about in the data. And each column here is a data file, okay, maybe an interview transcript. So telling us how many times each person has been coded as discussing each of these different people. So again, that's a pattern. Behind each cell is the qualitative data. So we can always get to see at how they're talking about these people, which may be much more important to us in our thematic analysis than how many times, but the how many times gives us access to that. In Quirkos, we can get something very similar, but in a completely different visualization. Down here, this is a project about breakfast habits. So down here are the different codes at the moment. And here we can see we're looking at what the respondents who identify as female are saying about these codes and comparing those with the males. And here we get both a comparison on the quantitative level and the qualitative level at the same time, which is a very common view and very useful. And something similar here from ATLAS.ti. Here's the quantification here, but always behind each cell is the qualitative data. So I think that even though these computer programs are generating numbers always, often it's not the numbers that we're interested in. Sometimes it really is in a thematic analysis, but not always. And if it's not, then we're just using these tables to get at the qualitative data to do our continued interpretation. Okay, I'm going to keep going until Sarah interrupts me and stops me. I've got a few more things to say.
I think you're fine too, Christina. People are really engaged, but there's not a huge number of questions at the moment, so crack on.
Okay, I'll keep going until you tell me otherwise. Okay, so phase 4, which for me overlaps with phase 3 when I'm using software, definitely. Okay, rather than reading all of this, you can read yourself when you get the video, or many of you have got the textbook, I'm sure. So I'm just going to skip to my next slide, which picks out the key points from this one, and then show you how that might look in different software programs. So Braun and Clarke talk about developing and reviewing themes, and they talk about assessing the fit, checking the themes make sense, okay, as being a key aspect of the process. And we can do that in numerous ways in qualitative software programs. And we are always connected to the source context. I think I've said that already many times. Okay, that's the key thing. Okay, always we're connected. Whatever we're visualizing, wherever we are, we can always drill back down and get to the original source context. And for me, that's one of the key benefits of using software. Radical revision, they talk about, really changing our codes and how we think about them being related. Software is designed for this, okay? And there's lots of different ways that we can reorganize our codes, and we can do this whenever we want, at any time, okay? We can move codes, we can merge codes, we can split codes, we can group codes, and there's lots of different tools that we have to do that. We also need to consider the relationship between the themes, queries, maps, and charts. I've already shown you a bunch of visualizations that are about doing exactly that in the previous phase, and that's to do with that overlap that I see between these phases, but also with existing knowledge. And this is really, really important. Yeah, in a qualitative software program, we can bring in the literature and work with it alongside the data that we're working with, and then we can really integrate via some of these tools and really consider, okay, what did the literature say about this, and how does that relate to what my data is now saying about that? Okay, and that's really powerful way of integrating existing knowledge with our analysis, because the software is a container for all our project materials. So let's just look at a few of these things. This is Delve, and here we can retrieve based on codes. Here are some codes, and we can retrieve. This is very similar to the screenshot that I showed you from Taguette. It's just a different program, and continually we can pull out and think about segments of data and how they've been coded in relation to other segments of data coded at the same code, but then also jump straight back to see where it occurs in its context. Okay, and that interconnectivity is happening again at this phase. We can also output things. Okay, now just because you're using a qualitative software doesn't mean that you have to sit behind the computer all the time. You can export coded data. This is a Word file that's been exported from Quirkos, actually, whereby the codes appear as comments in the Word file. You can then print that off, get out your highlighter pens. I've still got highlighter pens. I use them all the time. It's just that I'm printing out the bits of material that I want to work with right now outside of the software, and then going back to the software later on. Always possible, very easy, using any of these programs. For me, the radical revision is more manageable when I use software than when I use manual methods. Different people have different opinions about this. Not everybody will agree with what I've just said. Here you've got a photo of the first qualitative project that I ever did, my undergraduate dissertation back in 1994 or something like that, when I physically cut up my transcripts and I put them in a matrix, okay, and I color coded them. I find it much easier to reorganize things inside software now, because I've got spaces and tools for doing those kinds of things. Sarah's turned on her video, which means she wants me to stop.
if you want to wrap up, if you want to have 1 minute to wrap up, that's fine.
I'll wrap up by showing you this diagram, okay, which is the idea of combining methods. So this is a photo from when I was doing a piece of analysis a while ago, a few years ago, when I was kind of combining methods and putting things together. So that's really important. So just to flick through the remainder of my slides, just to finish up by saying that for me, this is really, really important. The idea that the notes that I take can happen at all of these different places. So this is just a conceptual diagram of the idea that I can stick sticky notes inside the software attached to any kind of different thing I want, and I can have them free floating about anything as well. So really my point is that those phases that we have, I'm just looking through my slides, of reflexive thematic analysis, in reality, when we're using software, we can move the pieces around into any order that we want, and we can also have them overlapping. So really, the software is giving us the flexibility to implement thematic analysis however we want, according to a particular way that it's been described, but also in a more flexible way, making use of a variety of different ways of thinking about data, if that's what we want to do. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Excellent, fantastic. We have one question here from Tiziana. In your experience in developing a project using reflexive thematic analysis, would you use multiple software, or would you pick one? And then your favorite add-on question, if one, which one, with a winky face?
Okay, so I think that's a really good question. And the answer to that question, I think, depends. So I think that many of the software programs that I've mentioned and shown screenshots of today could be used to do a reflexive thematic analysis. And having everything in one container has lots and lots of benefits, because it's all there in one place, and therefore all of those interconnectivity aspects that I've been talking about are really readily available to us. Having said that, you've seen that I often do work outside of software, and sometimes something that I want to do is not possible quite in the way that I want to do it within the software that I happen to have available or have chosen for this particular project. So in that kind of situation, I do sometimes go to another program to do something because it's not possible, or I prefer the way that it looks in that program, or whatever it might be. So I think it's very difficult to make to give one answer to that question that is a one size fits all for every project. And I think, you know, we can be very creative about how we use tools. These are tools. It's up to us how we use them, and we shouldn't feel constrained by them.
It's a very political answer. But I appreciate that. You cannot say which one you prefer here, but I appreciate the trying to
I appreciate the question, but the reality is that I don't actually have a favorite.
Okay,
if you were going to shoot me if I didn't come up with one, I probably would, right? But that's an extreme situation. You're not going to do that, Tiziana,
no.
So
we are in peace.
So I think you can make the software that you have available work for you.
Yeah.
It's also now possible to move data between programs in a way that wasn't possible in the past. So that changes the need for an answer to that question, I think.
So just one very final question in the final 2 minutes that we have from Mohammed. Is it important to have large data to use software like this, or can small data also be analyzed using software packages like you have shown?
Small data can definitely be used in using these packages, and many people are using these packages for small qualitative projects in terms of the amount of data. Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to call it to an end there. And say to everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Christina, thank you for walking us through what was an enormous amount of information. We're all going to enjoy going back over the recording of that, I'm sure. Just to remind everyone, the recording will be sent to you as registered participants to the webinar. And if you'd like to share it, we will provide you with the link that you can use to share it with others. It would be, oh yes, Christina's going to make the slides available, so that's great as well. Thanks, Christina. Lots of positive comments coming through. Thank you so much all for joining us. It's always such a pleasure to have you all with us, and looking forward to the next webinar, and we'll let you all know when that will be and what it will be about. Watch this space.
Thank you.
Thanks,
again,
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
so
and bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.